6.1 Introduction. One of the most important roles that a forensic psychologist will play is in criminal or offender profiling. Thus, in this context, we also need to learn about offender typologies. And the present unit will focus on exactly that is, offender typologies and criminal profiling. The unit will also touch upon juvenile delinquency, as this is one category of offenders that differs from adult offenders. The unit will also discuss forensic psychology and criminal investigation, in which we will discuss about what crime is, the role of a forensic psychologist in criminal investigation, criminal profiling and psychological autopsy. 6.2 Offender typologies. According to the Webster's Revised Unabridged Dictionary, offender is one who violates any law, divine or human, a wrongdoer. Crime is the breach of rules or laws for which some governing authority, via mechanisms such as legal systems, can ultimately prescribe a conviction. Individual human societies may each define crime and crimes differently. While every crime violates the law, not every violation of the law counts as a crime. For example, breaches of contract and of other civil laws may rank as offenses or as infractions. Modern societies generally regard crimes as offenses against the public or the state, distinguished from torts. The latter are offenses against private parties that can give rise to a civil cause of action. When informal relationships and sanctions prove insufficient to establish and maintain a desired social order, a government or a state may impose more formalized or stricter systems of social control. With institutional and legal machinery at their disposal, agents of the state can compel populations to conform to codes, and can opt to punish or attempt to reform those who do not conform. A method for classifying offenders or creating offender typologies has to be based upon personal or psychiatric or psychological factors, or situational environmental factors, or a combination of both psychological and situational elements. Besides the above, there are also the personality involvement in every criminal act and the presence of a certain situation or set of circumstances. The issue that should be considered here is that when classifying any offender, one must take the history of the individual's criminal behavior. A person who commits only a single crime differs in personality makeup from the one who repeats a criminal act several times or commits various crimes. The classification must reflect this, and the history of the offender's antisocial and criminal behavior will indicate whether the person should be labeled an acute, momentary, or a chronic, habitual, offender. Any classification, be it of plants, animals, or human beings, is to some extent artificial because there will always be individual characteristics or a set of characteristics which can properly be placed in more than one group. In our own attempt at classification, dealing as we often do with emotionally and mentally abnormal offenders, it is frequently difficult to distinguish between a criminal who is neurotic and one who suffers from a character disorder. Yet in spite of the shortcomings inherent in classification, we must attempt to categorize offenders if we are going to be successful in dealing with them. If we can classify them in a rational way, we can diagnose their characteristics, treat them, and predict their future behavior. However, such classification means that we will have to examine carefully each criminal to be able to find the characteristic and predominant traits that will tell us in which particular category the individual, offender, belongs. In trying to arrive at a system of classification in the field of criminology, we are faced with two problems: classifying the crimes and classifying the criminals. The first classification is a legal one, having its origin in criminal law. The law differentiates between crimes committed against the person, that is, crimes of violence, such as assault, murder, or sexual attacks, those committed against property, burglary or robbery, and crimes against the state. The law thus attempts to classify the criminal according to his/her act. This legally and sociologically colored method of classification is imperfect and unrealistic in the great majority of cases because an offender may very easily fit into two or all three of the categories. For example, he/she may kill and commit a burglary, thus committing crimes against person and property. One way of classifying offenders is to divide them according to those who commit crimes which are primarily directed against society, manifest criminals, such as gangsters, and those who commit crimes which primarily express their inner conflicts which are symptomatic or reactive criminals, such as the kleptomaniac, pyromaniac, sex offender, and a certain type of murderer. On the whole, individuals suffering from a neurotic or psychotic condition or from a character disturbance can also commit crimes which are mainly due to their mental condition. However, the drawback to such a classification is that the overwhelming majority of all offenders manifest inner conflicts. 6.2.1 Theories of classification regarding offenders, offender typologies. There are many theories of classification of offenders. Let us look at some of the theories. Lombroso expounded a type of classification based upon different criminal types. He divided criminals into the born criminal, the epileptic criminal, the criminal of irresistible passion, the insane and the feeble-minded criminal, including those of borderline mentality and the occasional criminal. The last group, that is the occasional criminal, was subdivided into pseudo-criminal, the criminaloid, and the persistent offender of non-abnormal type. Enrico Ferri divided criminals into occasional offenders and habitual offenders. To the first group belonged those whose criminal acts were due to external circumstances and who were driven to commit crimes because of a special passion. To the second group belonged those who were obviously insane or mentally defective, and those mental deviates with inborn criminal tendencies, the so-called psychopaths, and finally the persistent early offenders whose criminal behavior was caused by environmental elements. Franz von Liszt criticized the classification based upon the motivation of the criminal and instead followed a penological and sociological viewpoint, distinguishing between momentary offenders and corrigible and incorrigible permanent offenders. Although this classification is clear-cut, it neglects to include offenders who are legally insane and is therefore incomplete and inaccurate. In order to avoid such a pitfall, Charles Goring classified criminals into physical, mental, and moral types. An interesting method of classification was proposed by Ernst Kretschmer, who was the first to try to correlate the physical appearance of a person with his/her mental condition. Kretschmer's constitutional classification is based upon the study of people as psychobiological, or mental physiological entities. He established three types of personalities: the athletic, the asthenic schizothymic leptosemic, and the pinic. He stated that there exists a clear biological connection between mental disposition toward schizophrenia and the asthenic schizothymic leptosemic and the athletic body builds, and also between mental disposition toward a manic depressive condition and the pinic body type. His theory was applied to the classification of criminals, noting in particular that offenders who committed serious crimes were of the asthenic schizothymic leptosemic body build, while those offenders who committed less serious crimes had a pinic body build. While Kretschmer's idea of constitution is limited to a person's hereditary qualities, Olof Kinberg includes a person's reactions if they are the result of his/her predisposition or of his/her environment. Kinberg, in collaboration with Stobring, gives a psychological classification wherein psychobiological correlation is not so predominant as in Kretschmer's hypothesis. In classification of offenders, it must be noted that can only be valid on a causative or on an etiological basis. To classify according to the crime committed is untenable because the cause or causes of the crime are interrelated with the perpetrator and the person's environmental situation. Therefore, we can classify an offender only if we see the seriousness of the individual's crime in relation to that person's personality makeup. This is as true for the momentary offender as for the habitual one. While classifying the crime, one must also consider the frequency of the commission of the crime, as it reflects the degree of inclination toward crime and of abnormality present in the offender. Such classification, however, presupposes that criminals be carefully examined, particularly to determine how much of the ego participated in the criminal act. Also, to ascertain the causative factors responsible for criminal activities in the offender, we must examine each person individually and give each case a special consideration. Sometimes an offender manifests signs of a character disturbance and yet still may have anxieties and feelings of guilt. Or, on the surface, the offender may show signs indicating a neurosis, while deep within, the individual may have a character deformation, which will put the offender into another group altogether. Also, it must be kept in mind that a criminal may appear to be suffering from an anxiety hysteria, which may very well cover up a schizophrenic condition. The latter condition will place the offender in the psychotic classification, and not the neurotic one. Another important point to consider is whether or not a criminal's aggressive drive, which has become antisocial and which is the product of the offender's distorted emotional and mental condition. Only a careful examination of the offender, including his psychobiological development and the person's own personality reaction, will determine the causative factors responsible for the crime and the offender's place in the classification system. A system of classification which is methodologically sound may be limited in scope. The purpose of the formation of categories in criminology is to determine how to deal with the offender in a rational way, be it by the court, the district attorney, the prison official, the probation officer, or the psychiatrist. An operational approach is therefore necessary, which must take into consideration the offender's environmental background, immediate situation, and personality makeup. The classification will also have to be based on both sociological and psychological factors, the division of physical and mental diseases into acute and chronic ones, and the degree of severity of the disorder. This division can also be used to great advantage in classifying offenders because it connotes at once the degree of criminal involvement of the personality of the perpetrator. Therefore, offenders can be divided into two groups, viz. I. Acute or momentary offenders and 2. Chronic or habitual offenders. In designating a criminal as acute or chronic, we must take into consideration the seriousness of the crime or crimes committed, as well as the frequency and time factor. Otherwise, an individual who commits one premeditated murder would be considered simply an acute criminal, while another individual who repeatedly commits harmless or nuisance thefts would be considered a chronic offender. Obviously, this is wrong because the first individual is more dangerous than the second, even though the latter may have a personality defect. While such a personality defect may also be true of the murderer, the person might display definitely some emotional or mental imbalance. Such a person's personality makeup will be involved too much with the person's act to put him/her into the category of an acute offender. The offenders could also be classified as given below. Opportunist. An opportunist offender seeks out his/her victims regularly until caught. Experimenter. This type of offenders abuses as a part of sexual exploitation. Inadequate and opportunistic. This type of offender is mentally inadequate or has a stunned mental development. Pedophile. A pedophile has no sexual interest in adults and is sexually attracted to only prepubescent children, under the age of 13. Ephebophile. An ephebophile is sexually attracted to only post-pubescent children, adolescents between the ages of 14 and 18. Pederast, this type of offender engages in anal intercourse with boys under the age of 18. Non-exclusive, this type of offender is married or in a relationship with another adult but clearly desires children sexually and uses every opportunity to find situations where sexual contact with a child can happen. Exclusive offender, this type of offender is attracted only to children. Sex offenders, a sex offender is an individual who is either an ephebophile or a pedophile. 6.3 Juvenile delinquency. We need to discuss about juvenile delinquency in the context of offenders, as in this case the offender is below a certain age and is not considered as an adult. Thus, the offense committed is to be perceived under different circumstances and is also to be dealt with differently than that of offenders who are adults. Juvenile delinquency refers to the violation of law by a child. The person's age is under 18 years and is not yet considered an adult. Juvenile delinquency consists of two types of behaviors. Status offense. Status offense includes drinking, smoking, playing truant, running away from home, etc. These children behave in such a way they are uncontrollable and are generally treated by the juvenile justice system. Delinquency offense. Delinquent offenses include that are considered violent, involve murder, rape, armed robbery, aggravated and simple assaults, stalking, menacing, vandalizing, etc. There are various factors that could cause delinquency. One such factor is substance abuse. It is not that substance abuse causes delinquency or persons who are identified as delinquents use drugs and intoxicants and mind-altering drugs to get excited, etc. At the same time, substance abuse as such is highly and positively correlated with delinquency. In fact, those youngsters who take to drug abuse, etc., do suffer from many kinds of mental and physical health problems. All these eventually lead to delinquency. Poverty is another major problem that leads to delinquency. Though there is no direct relationship between the two factors, invariably research has indicated that high rates of delinquency are attributed to poverty and poor welfare. Children who engage in delinquent activities have been associated with poor families of origin. An assessment conducted on the causes of female delinquency also indicated that the female delinquency and conflict with the law were mainly lack of income, children's school fees not being paid, not having enough money to pay for their clothes or feed the family, etc. The youngsters often have too much energy and time on hand and could find it boring and time hanging, and thus he/she may look for some excitement that would satisfy his/her need for excitement and activities. When these are not available, his/her tendency is to indulge in some exciting activity which may end up in delinquency, that is doing something in conflict with the law or doing something wrong and not getting caught being kind of an adventure to such youngsters. It is important to keep a young person meaningfully occupied and productive, as the person feels he/she is doing something and earning his living. Even adventure sports would take care of the youngster's energy and keep him/her occupied and excited. It has also been observed that youngsters from the villages migrate to the urban areas in search of employment and work that could earn them some money. It is also noticed that they take up jobs that may not be fitting into their qualifications, but far lesser than justified, but yet go on with it as it gets them some money. These also cause frustrations and annoyance in them. Engaging in such jobs makes these youngsters resort to violence and at times to activities that bring them into conflict with the law. Another cause for delinquency could be the low or poor education amongst the youngsters. Lack of education and lack of skills are a few of the leading reasons for these youngsters not getting employment. Thus, as the frustration and disappointment mount along with the loss of a support system due to leaving the family cocoon in the village, make the youngster indulge in activities that are delinquent in nature. In addition to the above factors, dysfunctional family is also another important factor in leading to delinquency. Broken family, constant quarrels between partners in the family, rejection children or being violent towards them, using corporal punishment, not giving adequate care, love and affection to children etc. All these form part of social disorganization. Delinquency is attributed in all these cases to the absence of family, which is essential for children and youth's development of personality. The next important factor causing delinquency is identified as violence. Here violence refers to the children and youth being subjected to violence leading to psychological trauma. Such children and youngsters as they grow up resort to violent behaviors and many other behaviors that bring them into conflict with the law. Thus, children brought up in families and have been subjected to violence and abuse, turn up as delinquent as they grow up. The next factor contributing to delinquency is the peer influence. Many research studies have shown a significant relationship in the positive direction between these two factors. Thus, association with deviant youths is one of the important reasons for delinquency. In a relatively more recent study, by Yusuf et al., the authors pointed out that there is a negative and significant correlation between these two factors, viz., juvenile delinquency and peer influence. They suggested that every effort should be put in to educate these youths and train them so that they do not make friends with the deviant peers but with the right persons. As a forensic psychologist, it is important to focus on these factors, as based on this information, suitable intervention strategies could be developed to prevent the children and youth from becoming delinquents. In regard to interventions to help youngsters indulging in activities that conflict with the law, one of the more effective programs focused on interpersonal skill development, such as social skill training, anger management, and an important measure of reducing the youngsters' exposure to deviant peers. In addition, some of the community-based interventions such as providing recreational facilities and many after-school programs including sports, music and professional club activities etc., have been found to be effective in reducing delinquency. Furthermore, delinquency has been also associated with age, gender, prior delinquent activities, family support system, etc. also play a role in causing delinquency. Education, mental health services, juvenile justice and community programs in combination could help a great deal in reducing delinquency. Juvenile delinquency will be further discussed by us in detail in Unit 13 of this course. Box 6.2 Causes of crimes committed by young offenders. A young offender or juvenile offender is a person who has been convicted or cautioned for a criminal offense. Criminal justice systems often deal with young offenders differently from adult offenders, but different countries apply the term young offender to different age groups depending on the age of criminal responsibility in that country. The United Kingdom has three separate and distinct criminal justice systems: England and Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. Young offenders are often dealt with by the youth offending team. A juvenile delinquent is one who repeatedly commits crime. These juvenile delinquents sometimes have mental disorders / behavioral issues such as post-traumatic stress disorder or bipolar disorder, and are sometimes diagnosed with conduct disorder partially as a result of their delinquent behaviors. In England and Wales, the age of criminal responsibility is set at 10. Young offenders aged 10 to 17, i.e. up to their 18th birthday, are classed as a juvenile offender. Between the ages of 18 and 21, i.e. up to their 21st birthday, they are classed as young offenders. Offenders aged 21 and over are known as adult offenders. In Northern Ireland it is 10, and in Scotland the age of criminal responsibility is set at 8. One of the lowest ages of criminal responsibility in Europe. Minors who commit sexual crimes are adjudicated in a criminal court as sexual crimes are defined as sexually abusive behavior committed by a person under the age of 18 that is perpetrated against the victim's will, without consent, and in an aggressive, exploitative, manipulative, or threatening manner. It is important to examine the prevalence data and the characteristics of juvenile sex offenders, in order to obtain a precise understanding of this heterogeneous group. In the Europe and other advanced countries, there is a mandatory reporting of such offences, and this mandatory reporting laws makes it a necessity for the law enforcement agency to report any incidents of disclosed sexual abuse. Criminal youths or young offenders may further be classified as pseudo-criminals, those who may commit a criminal act but are not seriously out of social control. Their criminality is only incidental to the central problem they represent, namely, failure of society at large. 2. Immoral criminals, those who have somehow failed to internalize and fully accept the moral principles of their socially oriented families and subculture. 3. Real criminals, those who have imbibed criminal values and do not suffer from any guilt feeling when violating the law. It is important to find out the various causes for youth crimes or crimes committed by young offenders. These causes are presented below. Social disorganization. Social disorganization is one of the important causes. Current positivist approaches generally focus on the culture. A type of criminological theory attributes variation in crime and delinquency over time and among territories, to the absence or breakdown of communal institutions, for example family, school, church and social groups, and communal relationships that traditionally encouraged cooperative relationships among people. Merton, a sociologist, suggested 5 adaptations to the above approach based on his strain theory, and these are I. Innovation, 2. Retreatism, 3. Ritualism, 4. Conformity, v. Rebellion. Let us elaborate each of these below. I. Innovation, individuals who accept socially approved goals, but not necessarily the socially approved means. 2. Retreatism, those who reject socially approved goals and the means for acquiring them. 3. Ritualism, those who buy into a system of socially approved means, but lose sight of the goals. Merton believed that drug users are in this category. 4. Conformity, those who conform to the system's means and goals. v. Rebellion, people who negate socially approved goals and means by creating a new system of acceptable goals and means. A difficulty with strain theory is that it does not explore why children of low-income families would have poor educational attainment in the first place. More importantly is the fact that much youth crime does not have an economic motivation. Strain theory fails to explain violent crime, the type of youth crime which causes most anxiety to the public. Differential association. The theory of differential association also deals with young people in a group context, and looks at how peer pressure and the existence of gangs could lead them into crime. It suggests that young people are motivated to commit crimes by delinquent peers, and also they learn criminal skills from them. The diminished influence of peers after men marry has also been cited as a factor in desisting from offending. There is strong evidence that young people with criminal friends are more likely to commit crimes themselves. However, it can also be that the offenders prefer to associate with one another, rather than delinquent peers causing someone to start offending. Furthermore, there is the question of how the delinquent peer group became delinquent initially. Labeling. Labeling theory states that once young people have been labeled as criminal, they are more likely to offend. The idea is that once labeled as deviant, a young person may accept that role, and be more likely to associate with others who have been similarly labeled. Labeling theorists say that male children from poor families are more likely to be labeled deviant, and that this may partially explain why there are more lower-class young male offenders. Male phenomenon youth crime is disproportionately male, and theorists and others have examined why this is the case. One suggestion is that ideas of masculinity may make young men more likely to offend. Being tough and reckless may be a way young men attempt to express their masculinity. Acting out these ideals may make young men more likely to engage in antisocial and criminal behavior. Alternatively, rather than young men acting as they do because of societal pressure to conform to masculine ideals, young men may actually be naturally more aggressive, daring, etc. As well as biological or psychological factors, the way young men are treated by their parents may make them more susceptible to offending. According to a study, adolescent males who possess a certain type of variation in a specific gene are more likely to flock to delinquent peers. Other causative conditions leading to criminal behavior. There are many reasons why young people may get into trouble. These may stem from reasons including lack of discipline at home and in school, bad communication between parents and teenagers, peer pressure, violence at home, money problems, poor housing, instability, low grades at school, availability of drugs and alcohol, bullying and alienation, hyperactivity, learning problems and mental health problems. 6.4 Forensic Psychology and Crime Investigation. Before we focus on forensic psychology and crime investigation, let us explain about crime. 6.4.1 Crime. Crime can be explained as an act which contradicts the legal code and laws of the land. The study of crimes and deviants have been researched a great deal to find out who are the persons who commit the crimes and what is the motivation or cause for them to commit such crimes. Some of the definitions of crime have been given in Box 6.2. Box 6.2 Definitions of crime. A normative definition views crime as deviant behavior that violates prevailing norms, cultural standards prescribing how humans ought to behave normally. This approach considers the complex realities surrounding the concept of crime and seeks to understand how changing social, political, psychological, and economic conditions may affect changing definitions of crime and the form of the legal, law enforcement, and penal responses made by society. In other words, crime is the breach of rules or laws for which some governing authority, via mechanisms such as legal systems, can ultimately prescribe a conviction. Individual human societies may each define crime and crimes differently. While every crime violates the law, not every violation of the law counts as a crime. For example, breaches of contract and of other civil law may rank as offenses or as infractions. Modern societies generally regard crimes as offenses against the public or the state, distinguished from torts, offenses against private parties that can give rise to a civil cause of action. According to C. Darrow, crime is an act forbidden by the law of the land and for which penalty is prescribed. This constitutes a definition of a crime from the social viewpoint. From the legal viewpoint, violation of law constitutes crime. In other words of Brands and Teeters, the term crime technically means a form of antisocial behavior that has violated public sentiment to such an extent as to be forbidden by statute. Garofalo developed a concept of the natural crime and defined it as a violation of the prevailing sentiments of pity and probity. Radcliffe Brown defined crime as the violation of usage which gives rise to the exercise of a sanction. The crime any act which causes harm to man's social interests. The criminal is a person who commits crime. According to law, a criminal is one who has intentionally violated a criminal law. Sometimes a criminal is not treated as such until his criminal acts are proved in court. There are 7 interrelated but overlapping criteria to call an act as a crime. Ideally, behavior would not be a crime unless all the 7 conditions are present. Harm, before a behavior can be called crime there must be certain external consequences or harm. A crime has a harmful impact on social interests. Illegal, the harm must be legally forbidden, must have been prescribed in penal law. Antisocial behavior is not crime unless it is prohibited by law. Malefied intention, there must be the criminal conduct, that is, there must be an intentional or reckless action or inaction which brings about the harmful consequences, for example, doctor's negligence. Criminal intention, criminal intent must be present. Hall suggests that legal scholars have confused between intention and motive. The motives for a crime may be good but the intention is criminal. Thus if a man kills his starving children his motive is good but killing is legally forbidden and so his intention is criminal. Concurrence of intention and conduct, there must be a concurrence of criminal intention and conduct. E.g. If a policeman, who goes into a house to make an arrest goes into a house to make an arrest is not a trespasser from the beginning. Casual relationship, there must be a casual relationship between the legally forbidden harm and the voluntary misconduct. E.g. If a man dies of suffocation after being shot at, the relationship between conduct and the harm is not clear-cut. Prescription of punishment, there must be legally prescribed punishment. The voluntary misconduct must be punishable by law. Various types of crime have been discussed as follows. Crimes against persons. Crimes against persons can take any form, as for instance against children, adolescents, youths, adults and old persons. These crimes are also called as personal crimes. These include murder, rape, robbery and aggravated assaults. Crimes against property. These consist of causing bodily harm to other persons, burglary, looting a person's home and the belongings thereof, stealing cars, and many electronic and other appliances of great value. Larceny is another crime that comes in this category. Larceny means theft of physical items, whereas theft refers to all variations of stealing property from another person. Many other crimes such as stealing cars, thefts of many articles kept within the car or automobile of any type, are all crime against properties. Arson is another major crime that causes untold harm to public and private property. This is a criminal act in which a person deliberately sets fire to property. It is a willful act of destroying someone's property by deliberately burning the same. The individual who commits arson has a fraudulent or criminal intent. Hate crimes. Another category of serious crime is hate crimes. These are against persons or property belonging to a certain religion, caste, community or group against which there is considerable degree of prejudice. Crimes against morality. These are crimes in which there is no victim and no complainant. Examples of such crimes for instance are illegal gambling, prostitution, illegal drug use etc. Morality refers here to social and personal values of people in a society that defines how people should behave. It is a kind of code of conduct for people. When crimes of morality occurs, it is against these moral values and the code of conduct. It includes soliciting or selling or buying sex for profit, and is considered not respectable. White-collar crime. The term was coined in 1939. By Edwin Sutherland, it refers to the full range of frauds committed by businessmen and government officials. White-collar crimes are crimes committed by people of high social status who commit their crimes in the context of their occupation. This includes embezzling, stealing money from one's employer, insider trading, tax evasion, and other violations of income tax laws. Organized crimes. In addition to the above, there are also organized crimes, which involves distribution and sale of illegal and goods and services such as the sand mafia etc. These are organized crimes as a particular group exercises control over large illegal enterprises, as for example it can also involve trading in drugs, weapon smuggling, money laundering, etc. These are also kind of big industries taking on the corporate form. The owners of these corporates control all the profits, they have under them a large number of employees working for them, and also they supply huge amounts of these materials to many businesses who are their clients. 6.4.2 Role of a forensic psychologist in crime investigation. The role of forensic psychologist in crime investigation mainly focuses on detailed explanation of the behaviors of the individual at the time of crime and before, to help the court and the law to deliver fair justice to the persons concerned. Forensic psychology associates the criminal's behavior and personality to the crime investigation and thereby an explanation and interpretation of the individual's behavior observed at the crime scene. The appropriate and adequate as well as evidence-based interpretation is very important for a successful investigation. Forensic psychologist collects 5 types of behavioral characteristics including 1. The amount of planning that went into committing the crime. 2. The degree of control used by the offender. 3. The escalation of emotion at the scene. 4. The risk level of both offender and the victim. 5. Whether it is organized or unorganized crime scene. All these 5 characteristics become part of the evidence. In crime investigation, the forensic psychologist carries out profiling of the criminals called as criminal profiling. They also interview suspects, victims and their relatives, etc. They also serve as expert witnesses in the court regarding the cases. Forensic psychologists also help in police identification parade where the victim is required to identify from amongst a number of persons the one who had committed the offense. This kind of identification is based on the memory of the individual who is asked to identify. Many times, the person's ability to call may be contaminated because of his/her own biases, emotional lability, and stress factors arising due to the trauma experienced during the crime. Also, other factors that can affect the memory are the poor light conditions that affect the visibility when the crime was committed, as well as the time gap between the time the entire crime was committed and the time when the parade identification was scheduled. Since the identification of the culprit is important evidence, every effort to address the above-mentioned factors is important, and here comes the role of forensic psychologists who can state on the basis of their scientific understanding of memory etc. whether the person who is called to identify can really do justice, and how far the identification is devoid of any false recall. Forensic psychologists are called upon by both criminal and civil courts to ascertain if the defendant is mentally capable of standing trial in the courts. The forensic psychologist evaluates the defendant and presents his/her opinion about the individual's ability to understand the proceedings happening in the court, and whether the accused can understand and direct his lawyer as to how he/she is not guilty, etc. The forensic psychologist thus evaluates and assesses the cognitive, emotional and psychological competence of the person standing trial in the court. They integrate mental health evidence and practices with the court proceedings. They help to determine the causes underlying the crime, which goes a long way in the accused being liable for the commission of the crime. Thus, the expert testimony by forensic psychologists helps to overcome false convictions, inappropriate sentencing and many other wrong judgments, including wrongful acquittals. Forensic psychology thus focuses on behaviors, cognition, emotion, intelligence and other important aspects of the accused, witness and relevant others, are also involved in rehabilitating the individual, both victim and the accused, when released from the prison. Forensic psychologists not only provide a diagnosis of a crime, why, what and how, as well as the motive underlying the commission of a crime, also helps in treating the accused for his wrong behaviors, setting right his thinking processes and making him /her more responsible and capable of contributing to the society by controlling his behaviors and criminal tendencies. Thus, forensic psychologists are very closely associated with a criminal investigation, in addition to many contributions that they make during criminal or civil trials and later on contribute to the delivery of fair justice by providing behavioral and psychological perspectives to the individual perpetrator standing as accused in the courts and provides treatment and rehabilitation programs for the convicts within the prison and when released on bail or on parole or from prison after the sentence is completed. 6.4.3 Criminal profiling. Criminal profiling is also known as offender profiling and is used by police and law enforcement agencies to identify likely suspects during their investigation. Once they have the profile of a certain type of criminal, then shortlisting criminals and looking for a certain group makes it easier to identify the culprit. This profiling is an investigative strategy used by law enforcement agencies to identify likely suspects. Forensic psychologists work out a psychological profile of the offender based on various aspects like the state of the crime scene, behaviors of the criminals in the present situation, behaviors of criminals in different situations, personality traits of different criminals, whether the person is organized, disorganized or a mix of organized and disorganized personality features. Synopsis of the crime and description of the crime scene. The weather that prevailed at the time when the crime was committed, political and social environment. Autopsy report, photos and sketches of the crime scene. Background information of the victim. Crime assessment, which consists of reconstruction of the sequence of events, behaviors of the offender and victim, classification of the crime, strategies used by the victim, stages in committing the crime, motivation for committing the crime, and crime scene dynamics. Thus, based on the above, a criminal profile is created that can help in understanding the type of person who committed the crime, and the person's behavior in relation to the crime. Further, once apprehended and the accused offender admits guilt, forensic psychologist conducts a detailed interview to check the validity of the profiling made by him/her. Other questions for which forensic psychologists try to find answer include whether the crime was planned, was the crime committed on an impulse, and was there any strong emotional circumstances that led to committing the crime, etc. Yet another question deals with the gender and approximate age of the offender, his residence or living area and its proximity to the crime scene, etc. This information is extremely useful to target the culprit. Also, in order to collect the required information, the forensic psychologist conducts a thorough interview of not only the offender but also the witnesses, relatives, friends and acquaintances who could or are even remotely connected with the crime. Each of these persons requires a different approach and interviewing style. To take an example, if a child is a witness to a crime, interviewing the child is to be very different using other appropriate techniques like drawing, painting, play, etc. On the same line, if the offender decides to confess, instead of the police, the forensic psychologist could get the most relevant and factual information using special skills in which they have been trained. The forensic psychologist uses the offender's profile that he/she created, to determine the typical approach they have to use so that correct information and facts are obtained. 6.4.4 Psychological autopsy. A psychological autopsy is a very valuable tool in a criminal investigation. Through this, the forensic psychologist is able to collect all the available information regarding the victim of the crime, the deceased, through interviews of family members, relatives, friends as well as health personnel. In addition, information is collected from available healthcare and psychiatric records, other documents, and forensic examination. Thus, A psychological autopsy integrates and synthesizes all the information obtained from multiple sources, informants and records. The psychological autopsy, which is a standard approach, gathers information through a semi-structured interview of key informants. Whenever there is a discrepancy, they re-interview the informant, hold a case conference and use the best estimate procedures. The report of the psychological autopsy provides the following. 1. In-depth information is presented about the cause of death based on interviews with key persons, the medical autopsy report, medical records, and relevant documents. The sources from where the information was acquired have to be clearly documented for evaluation and its potential validity. 2. The forensic psychologist and other mental health professionals provide systematic details about the important psychological stages in the person's thought processes, including the personality trait, psychopathic/sociopathic personality, motivation to commit the crime, etc. 3. Since the forensic psychologist is presenting his /her interpretation of the facts, which are again limited, makes the forensic psychology evidences somewhat not very valid, as in any case the final judgment as to the mode of death will be based upon a review of all the known facts and circumstances, including the magisterial report, forensic medical report, police reports, crime scene analyst reports, and the psychological reconstruction. While in a physical autopsy, the causes for death are explained. Similarly, in psychological autopsy, an attempt is made to explain why a person has taken their life. This is done, as mentioned earlier, through analyzing medical records, interviewing friends and family, and conducting research into a person's state of mind prior to their death. There are many reasons to ordering psychological autopsy. Most importantly, it is carried out in suicide cases, to decide without any doubt that the person had committed suicide. It is a useful tool to gather information for understanding why a person committed suicide, and then onwards to work out strategies to prevent suicides. The indications for psychological autopsy are as follows: to decide whether a case is suicidal or accident or murder. Drug-ingested deaths also raises doubts about accidental or suicidal. Firearm-related deaths require an in-depth analysis of the history of the individual, the obsession of the person to own weapons, carelessness in handling weapons, etc. In the cases of suicides by drowning, whether it was suicide or homicide is determined by not only evidence left by the victim, but also by psychological autopsy. Two main investigations are carried out using psychological autopsy, and these include the psychosocial factors contributing to death and determining the manner of death. Towards the completion of the investigations, the forensic psychologist collects information by collecting details of the medical and case history of events surrounding the case concerned, the details of the scene of crime and the quality of the autopsy. In this, the forensic pathologist and the doctor conducting the post-mortem provide the results of the medico-legal autopsy and indicate the cause of death, the manner in which the death occurred, the circumstance of death, etc. The forensic pathologist works almost like a detective and probes and investigates the truth behind the death. The medical doctor or the medical examiner certifies the many aspects related to death. This certification by the doctor or the medical examiner who conducted the post-mortem is of great importance for legal, social, medical and research implications. The forensic team that investigates the death in detail often consists of magistrate, medical examiner / doctor conducting the post-mortem, forensic psychologist, psychiatrist, a psychiatric social worker, police and the law enforcement official dealing with the crime. The psychological autopsy functions as an important investigative tool which covers many factors that have contributed to death. The forensic psychologist uses his/her skills and training as well as typical techniques to assess the deceased person's behavior, thoughts, feelings and the relationships he/she had its different people, both nears and dears and friends and other persons with whom he/she had interacted and who could have some information to provide in regard to the death that occurred. They conduct interviews with the relevant people identified as informants, in addition to the deceased person's doctor, physician and other relevant persons to prepare a psychological autopsy report. Such a psychological autopsy report becomes essential and important mainly because the medical examiner, or the forensic scientists and forensic pathologists do not have the skill or have had any training in the behavioral aspects of humans. These behavioral aspects provide a very important contribution to understanding of both the perpetrator of the crime and the victims in terms of their motivation, state of mind, impulsivity, the kind of relationship negative or positive and the mental health as well as other psychological factors that gives clue to determining how far the accused is responsible for the crime and what factors within the victim had also led to the crime. Thus, it may be stated that psychological autopsy is conducted to obtain information in regard to the many behavioral and psychological factors within the perpetrator as well as the victim which all could have led to the concerned crime. Whatever motivated the perpetrator to commit the crime, what were the typical characteristic traits or behaviors in the victim that led to choosing him/her as a target for attack? The major criticism against psychological autopsy focuses on its limitations. There is no standard measurement tool to ascertain if the interviewee is telling the truth and whether his statements are valid and reliable. The records related to the accused and the victim may be so many years ago that it may not be very relevant at the time the crime was committed. In interview, many of the individual's recollections may not be totally accurate as over time, many things in the memory may have been erased and many associated but irrelevant things would have been added. All these would vitiate the psychological autopsy report. Another drawback is the information related to the mental state and behavior of the victim. Quite often those who are interviewed may give distorted information about the victim's mental state, and based on that the report presents the mental status of the victim which may not be the correct one. Many times, during the interview by the forensic psychologist, the interview will try to recall certain incidents and events that had occurred in the past having some bearing on the crime. However, many of these recalls may not be accurate and the respondents may have the tendency to recall more of positive than negative aspects, thus rendering the psychological autopsy unreliable as it may thus contain biased information based on false and biased information also. Researchers and practitioners have pointed out over the years serious methodological problems in the psychological autopsy reports. Most psychological autopsies are conducted more on medical model paradigm and the report relates the crime with mental. This is one type of wrong association as mental disorder may not necessarily cause the person to indulge in the offense. For instance, in the case of suicide, mental disorder may not be the real cause but various other factors may be linked to suicide. By using the medical paradigm, the tendency will be to associate the offense with mental disorder. Another drawback is that forensic psychologists do not use standardized measuring instrument to assess the mental disorder and its severity. They invariably use non-standardized and ill-defined instruments for diagnostic purposes. Often they use unstandardized semi-structured questionnaire which leaves the results open to interviewer bias. Another limitation is related to the informants. Very often the informants are highly emotional and thus their response will be tinged with exaggeration of the negatives. Since there is no systematic control in the selection of informants, their attitudes towards crime, murder or suicide, as well as their emotion-laden responses render the results biased, and thus the psychological autopsy report becomes unreliable. One other important problem in regard to the psychological autopsy is related to the interviewers themselves. Before interview, whether the interviewers were well trained, whether they were alerted to look for their own bias and errors that may creep into the interviewing situation. This adds to the report being again not very reliable and valid. The next problem in psychological autopsy is concerned with the time lapse between the occurrence of the offense and the interview. If there is a very long gap, the memory of the event gets considerably changed with addition of materials or deletion of materials from the factual narrative. This would affect the report adversely. Despite the many adverse aspects and many limitations that are considered a part of psychological autopsy, yet this is an invaluable tool in criminal investigations, diagnosis and finding out the causative factors leading to the offense. Though physical evidences are maximally taken to explain an offense, in quite a few cases, psychological autopsy provides such information on the behavior, thought patterns, cognitive abilities, emotions and motivation to commit a crime etc., that these psychological aspects overrule the physical evidence and the judgment given becomes quite different from what is thought of based on physical evidence. Thus, psychological autopsy in both criminal and civil cases presents the mental state of the individual prior to death. In countries such as the USA, psychological autopsies are permitted as evidence in the courts, criminal or civil. Psychological autopsy is a very useful investigative tool in criminal investigations. It examines all factors that are around the crime concerned and also includes the mental health and well-being of the witnesses being questioned regarding the crime that took place. In India, psychological autopsy is used more as a research instrument to understand the various factors in the case of suicidal deaths and the causes that led to suicide. It works out the association and dynamic interaction between mental health issues and risk factors associated with suicidal deaths. It throws light on the various stressful life events in the individual's life ultimately culminating in suicide. Psychological autopsy is a very sensitive and important tool to examine the state of mind of the people close to the deceased in order to reconstruct events leading up to the death. 6.5 Let us sum up. In the present unit, we focused on offender typologies and criminal profiling. According to the Webster's Revised Unabridged Dictionary, offender is one who violates any law, divine or human, a wrongdoer. We also focused on various theories with regard to classification of offenders. Further, the unit also explained juvenile delinquency. We need to discuss about juvenile delinquency in the context of offenders, as in this case the offender is below a certain age and is not considered as an adult. Thus, the offense committed is to be perceived under different circumstances and is also to be dealt with differently than that of offenders who are adults. Juvenile delinquency refers to the violation of law by a child. The person's age is under 18 years and is not yet considered an adult. We also discussed about forensic psychology and crime investigation, in which we explained about crime and types of crime, role of a forensic psychologists in crime investigation, criminal profiling and psychological autopsy.